You've heard of Zoids, or, well, probably not. It is pretty niche. But you might remember it as like a fever dream from your childhood back when, your dad would wake up at like 5 o'clock in the morning for work, waking you up. At which point you'd go to the TV, find something to watch, and the only thing that happened to be on at 5 a.m. was, of course, Zoids. Well, wouldn't you know it, as with most anime, Zoids Chaotic Century has a manga. But this isn't your usual manga that the anime is based off. This is one of those cases where the anime is only loosely based off what happens in the manga. It takes inspiration from it, if you will, and manages to carve its own unique path in order to deliver its own fantastic story. You see, the first mainline Zoids anime, Zoids Chaotic Century, was originally created as a way to market and sell toys, the Zoids model line for Takara Tomy. Yet, somehow, along the way, Zebek managed to make a great war story with some really interesting adult underlying themes in it. Most of which eluded me as a child because I literally just saw big, flashy, shiny robot lions and dinosaurs. But to this day, Zoids is still one of the quote-unquote kids shows that my parents will still every now and then remark on and say that, they enjoyed watching with me as a child. But this isn't about the anime. I've made a whole separate video on that already if you want to check it out. This is about Uyama Michiro's manga under the same name, Zoids Chaotic Century. The Zoids Chaotic Century manga is much shorter than its anime counterpart, so things do move and escalate at a much faster rate. And like I said at the beginning, they are vastly different stories. If you know anything about JoJo, you can think of the Chaotic Century anime as part 4, and then the manga as like part 8. We've got a lot of the same characters we know and love in a very familiar setting, but have a whole new story to follow and enjoy. And the first way that the manga sets itself apart is through some in-depth world building. Although not directly in the manga panels, once we hit the 4th volume, we start to get a dissection of the history of Planet Z, at least dating back around 300 years. Planet Z's history gets alluded to in the anime, but never directly explored. Don't forget though, this manga and this world is a completely different timeline from the anime, so you can't really take anything from here as canon, quote unquote, with what the anime shows, but it's still nice to set the scene, especially for the manga. Our history lesson starts on the central continent, year 1800, with the original inhabitants of Planet Z. After some disputes, by the year 1957, the tribes on the central continent were unified under King Helic. He then had 2 sons, his first being Helic II, born in 1957, and his second son being Xenavas, born in 1959, a few years later. In 1978, after the passing of King Helic, Helic II dissolves the monarchy and becomes president of the New Republic. Around this time, Xenavas is framed for something and is exiled from the Republic. In retaliation, he forms the Empire, and the First Continental War begins. Some 50 years later, humans from Earth crash land on Planet Z. Now we're in the year 2030 and the Zoids arms race has begun. Iron Kongs are developed to counter Gojuluses, Ultrasauruses are developed to counter Iron Kongs, Iron Kong Mark IIs are developed to counter Ultrasauruses, Gojulus Mark IIs are developed to counter Iron Kong Mark IIs, and so on and so forth. This all happens in the span of around 7 years. By 2039, the Xenavas capital falls and Xenavas himself is exiled to the Dark Continent. By 2041, he manages to team up with the Gylos Empire from the Dark Continent and wage war on the Helic Republic again. Around a year later, the Helic Republic's shield Liger was finally rolled out and managed to hold off the Xenavas Empire's new army for quite some time, as it was the only Republican Zoid that could handle the new Zoids the Gylos Empire had in store for them. In 2044, the Xenavas Empire, obviously paired with the Gylos Empire, finished development of the first Deathsaurer, which changed the tides of everything, and within that same year, the Republican capital falls. In 2048, 4 years later, the Mad Thunder is rolled out to counter the Deathsaurer and the Republic takes back the capital. 2 years after that, in 2051, the Xenavas Empire falls, and the Continental Civil War ends. But unfortunately, it doesn't all end there, because within that same year, the Intercontinental War begins. The remnants of the Xenavas Empire are fully absorbed into the Gylos Empire, and Gylos decides to declare war on the Helic Republic. 2 years later, in 2553, the Empire rolls out the Gilvader, which turns the tides of the war for 3 long subsequent years until 2556, where the King Gojulus is finally completed by the Republic, which again turns the side of the battle into their favour. Before the Republic can finish the war, a meteorite strikes planet Z. Or more specifically, the meteor destroys one of Z's 3 moons, which crashes down onto Z, splitting the central continent into 3, and sinks a majority of the Dark Continent underwater. 40 years later, in 2097, Emperor Gailos passes away and Prince Rudolph is declared as Gailos' heir, with Regent Prozan appointed as his guardian. 2 years after that, Prozan begins another war on the Helic Republic, and that is where we are at the start of the story. Jesus Christ, what a mouthful. Now, while some of this is quite similar to what we see in the anime, a lot of it is manga exclusive lore. So now that we've got our new background and setting out of the way, let's go over our new story. Our story starts off with a very familiar premise. We follow Van Flyheight, a kid from a small village on planet Z, who one day, whilst being chased by a Geysak, finds himself in some old ruins and uncovers a wild Zoid sleeping in a giant pod, with a smaller pod next to it. And that's honestly where the major story beat similarities end. Van names this new wild Zoid Zeke after his father's late command wolf, and they fuse together Attack on Titan style to fight off the Geysak. No, the little Zoid Zeke doesn't get like huge like a Titan, but it's just the way they merge, and particularly unmerge, that really just reminds me a lot of Eren peeling out of the Attack Titan. And considering this merge is the way they rawly fight without any big old Zoid to pilot, makes the comparison just feel fitting. Anyhow, Zeke follows Van back to town carrying the other pod with him. And once we arrive, we get our first encounter with Van's main rival throughout the rest of the series, Raven. Raven's quite the dick in the manga, making his first impression by desecrating Van's father's grave with an infected Saberfang and having it then run amok in the town. This is where we learn Raven's Wild Zoid Shadow's ability. It can enhance a Zoid by 3 times its natural potential, but the caveat is that the Zoid perishes afterwards. In an effort to save the town, we get the first glimpse at Zeke's ability, which is to revive Zoids from even the brink of death. Van's father's old command wolf is brought back to life, and Van and Zeke proceed to use it to fend off the Saberfang and protect their home. In this fight, we get a look at another of Zeke's abilities, which is to connect with the heart of a Zoid and share its memories. So, Van gets to hear his absolute chad of a father's final words through the lens of the command wolf, and grants the Zoid its final wish to defend the town, even if it ends up being destroyed in the process, ending the battle in a draw with both the Saberfang and Command Wolf destroyed. Raven sees this as an absolute win, as the more Zoids that die, the better. At least to him. Enter Fiona, emerging from the other capsule in some futuristic style getup and using her ability to heal Van and Zeke afterwards. Similarly to the anime, she has amnesia but does recall her name being Fiona. Now that Van has a little Zoid friend of his own, and a cause he can get behind, getting Fiona's memory back, he takes them and sets off on an adventure, which feels far more reckless in the manga as they are just walking in the desert. I don't know about you, but if I was Fiona, I wouldn't let that slide. No man is going to make me walk through a desert without so much as a map. I hate sand. It's coarse and rough and gets everywhere. But here is where we get to meet another integral member of our cast. The kind of rough-ish mercenary who quickly turns good guy and becomes one of the squad, Irvine. You might remember him from the anime too, but in the manga, he pilots a slippery, snaky stealth viper, which I gotta say does not suit him at all. Oh, and it's also named Tornado. Pretty common thing in this manga for these guys to actually name their Zoids, kind of like a pet almost. I mean, I kind of get it because they technically are living machines, but it really just kind of gives off naming your car vibes. And I mean, like, come on. Who names their car? I'm even a car guy, and I know lots of other car guys, and I don't know anyone that names their car. Anyway, Irvine's being chased by bandits who are after a relic he's stolen known as the Shadow Key. Also chasing down Irvine is a wild shield Liger whom he stole this relic from in the first place. This shield Liger's name is Ceasar and was once piloted by our next key character, Moonbay's brother, before he unfortunately passed away. Moonbay is a fantastic mechanic and basically just a drifter. No, not that kind. but inevitably hangs around Van and Irvine and Fiona and the gang throughout the rest of the story. So we get an all-around crazy battle with the bandits and Irvine and the shield Liger, and unfortunately Ceasar takes a near fatal blow from a railgun. And in an attempt to revive it so that it doesn't end up like the Command Wolf, Van uses Zeke and Fiona's combined power to tap into its memories. After which Ceasar finds a new respect for Van, knowing what he's gone through throughout his life, and decides to take him on as his new pilot, just like Moonbay's brother wanted before he passed. Merged together, they perform some crazy feats, like dodging a railgun shot with a 0.1 second time gap. It's absolutely insane stuff, and reason number one why I just can never take this manga into consideration whenever I power scale Zoids from the anime. Van and his Liger win this battle, and afterwards we get a panel of them visiting Moonbay's brother's grave. And weirdly enough, in this very panel, it looks like they used an image of like the Tommy model kit Zoid shield Liger, probably to save time. I mean, it's a hell of a lot easier to do that than draw it, I guess. So now after all that, we finally have our little gang that will take us through the rest of the series. And at this point, we're already 4 volumes in, so we're more than a quarter of the way through the entire story. So I wasn't lying when I said it was a short one. Our journey continues and takes us to the seaside town of Porto, where we get to meet Irvine's little sister, Rebecca. This town's a little special because it runs completely off solar power, which is generated from the town's main stationary Zoid, Wendine. These big old stationary Zoids are quite common throughout this rendition of Z, and typically towns or cities are based around them due to the benefits they give to the people, kind of like generators in Zoids Genesis. As the gang arrive in Porto, we get our first proper introduction to the Empire, who lands just off the coast in a giant transporter Zoid called a Leviathan. Another familiar face from the anime, Lieutenant Shoebolts, shows his face and says he's looking for a spy supposedly located in the town of Porto, threatening to tear the town apart if nobody gives him up by morning. Van overhears what's going on and wants to fight him here and now, but out of nowhere Raven shows up and actually gives him some decent advice. If Van decides to fight Shoebolts then and there, they might end up just destroying the town anyway. So at this stage, his energy is best served trying to find this Republican spy. Plus, Raven drops a teensy bit more info to us, saying that the Empire brought a monster with them anyway, so Van wouldn't want to try and initiate that fight. Our Republican spy ends up being Rob Herman, another familiar face from the Chaotic Century anime. The gang make an effort to help him contact his fellow Republican forces, but unfortunately, the first wave of Republican forces that arrive come in vain, just as the monster Raven was referring to is released upon them. This monster is a Genosaurer, a crazy powerful Tyrannosaurus type Zoid piloted by Raven and enhanced by Shadow. It was specifically created for Raven by a guy named Dr. F so that it could actually withstand Shadow's enhancements, as every other Zoid Shadow's merged with has been claimed to die. And what this Genosaurer can do is the second reason why I can't use manga feats as like an analysis point when I'm power scaling the anime and doing fights there. This thing can practically fly and fire its big mama weapon, the charged particle gun, from the air, which is a far cry from anything it can do in the anime already. Van tries to put up a fight with Raven and his shield Liger Ceasar gets absolutely demolished. Yeah, the shield Liger Van's fought with like once or twice in the 3 chapters he's piloted it was completely bent over, folded, annihilated even. Raven then takes it upon himself to destroy Wendine. So as desperate times call for desperate measures, Van uses the shadow key he got from Moonbay and Ceasar way back when and kind of half heals Ceasar with it, put up one final stand against Raven. Raven then, of course, humiliates Van a second time and throws him and the Liger right into Wendine. Fortunately enough, at this point, Fiona comes in with her magical girl powers and creates an evolution cocoon around the Liger and Wendine. With the combined power of Zeke, Fiona, and Wendine, Ceasar the Shield Liger evolves into a Blade Liger and bursts through the cocoon. So now we're about 12 chapters into this manga, roughly halfway. There's 14 volumes in total. I only have 7 of them in physical copies. But at this point, Van already has the Blade Liger. So if it isn't clear already, this manga really just chucks things into overdrive and throws you into the deep end, continuously one-upping itself and escalating so fast. We don't really even get much development for any of the characters or their Zoids up until this point. And Van got a grand total of 2 fights with Ceasar as the Shield Liger before it evolves into the Blade Liger. If you'll let me compare it to the Chaotic Century anime once again, Van and the Shield Liger had fought 20 battles, traveled far and wide across the continent, meeting many significant characters integral to the story along the way, and got some character-defining moments, such as when Van confronts the soldier in episode 16, and when he reflects on his stubbornness and immaturity getting the Shield Liger destroyed in episode 23. We get very similar story beats in both stories, but one with far more character development and build-up, which makes the key moment, the Blade Liger's appearance, feel far more earned. In the manga's case, half the credit of the Blade Liger's evolution is given to the stationary Zoid Wendine, lending them their power, and the transformation happens near instantaneously. So all the suspense and build-up and mourning from Van is just thrown away for instant gratification, which is just a damn shame. Anyway, back to the manga, and Van is once again fighting Raven. This time, Blade Liger versus a Genosaurer. The Blade Liger is faring off far better than the Shield Liger did, absolutely embarrassing the Genosaurer and showing off some crazy new utility, like directing its shield to be underneath its feet so that it can actually float on water. No need to ask me how that works, just know that it does. And now finally, in the heat of battle, we get to see some emotion and character development from someone. And wouldn't you know it, it's from Raven. He is frustrated at the lengths Van would go to stop him and just doesn't understand why Van feels the need to be a hero and save everyone. Raven gets to project his reasoning onto why he seeks out the destruction of Zoids onto Van, which is something that never gets to happen in the anime. But in this instance, Raven loses the Battle of Wills as well as the Zoid battle itself, with the Genosaurer ending up decapitated amongst some pretty sweet action panels. This whole battle plants the seed of doubt into Raven, and once it's over, as a sign of respect, Raven swears to Van he will not kill another Zoid. That is, until he can come back and kill Van first. Now that the battle's over, the gang can finally pick up where they left off and continue their adventure to do there's been non-stop battle and action in this manga. We've kind of lost sight on why Van and Fiona even left Van's hometown to begin with, to try and find the Zoid Eve, which will hopefully help Fiona get her memory back. They found a lead pointing them to New Helic City, the Republican capital, so that's their next destination. And lo and behold, just like Berserk, we get a pretty mid-boat arc. The gang hop onto a giant turtle ferry which will take them to their next destination. But unfortunately, they are disrupted halfway through this journey by mines. After all, there is a war currently going on, in case anybody forgot about that. Enter little girl genius Melissa Sue, who happens to be partially at fault for the predicament they're all in right now. She created the skeleton, so to speak, of a Zoid which was programmed to survey the ocean. However, these plans got taken over by the Helic Republic and was turned into a weapon. A Zoid that absolutely loves Minesweeper. To circumvent this whole issue, Van uses the Blade Liger to make a giant shield underneath the big turtle transporter Zoid to protect it from mines. Once again, don't ask me how this works, it just does. And I can't lie, this whole mini arc in and of itself feels very inconsequential to the story. But we do get introduced to the Alcabalino gang, who again you might remember from the Chaotic Century anime. They have a little fight underwater with Van and Irvine. Irvine's stealth viper gets a bit damaged, and surprisingly enough, Van and the Blade Liger can actually fight underwater. Again, don't ask me how that works. Back to progressing the story, because the stealth viper got damaged, Moonbay and Irvine kind of fuck off for a bit. And I mean, more power to them really. If we look back on this story, we gotta wonder why they're even on this adventure with Van and Fiona anyway. This isn't ever really explained in the anime rendition either, but it feels more appropriate as we get far more time with these characters. Irvine decides to fuck off and come back every now and then for a bit, before inevitably staying for a good while. And Moonbay feels like she owes Van for helping to save her early on. So, I mean, it kind of explains itself, but doesn't really in the manga. I guess I'm just nitpicking at this point. Regardless, they split up, and Van and Fiona find themselves on the way to the city of Mule. And on their way there, they happen to meet the Madam President in a vineyard. We also get to meet the Imperial Lieutenant Kirsch Hart Driegel. I think I did that right. Kirsch Heart Regal, who's kind of flexing her authority in a Republican territory and trying to egg them on to fight back and start the war rather than the Empire doing it. Van doesn't quite get the concept, but fortunately enough, it's explained to him by the president. After this whole shenanigan, they finally arrive in the city of Mule. We meet Republican Lieutenant Paris, and of course we have politics, and more politics, with Van making a critical error of trying to protect the city of Mule from a automated Imperial Redler. Because of this fatal mistake and not wanting to start a all-out battle with the city of Mule and the Empire, Van takes it upon himself to go to the closest Imperial base and apologize, telling Lieutenant Shoebolt, who happens to be there, that he was acting independently. They forgive, but don't forget, one of Prozen's knights, Lieutenant Hannah, decides to also take it upon herself to act independently and attack Van in the Blade Liger in her Death Stinger, which is a big old scorpion type Zoid that is quite damn powerful. And unfortunately, Van kind of just gets torn apart here. But luckily, he manages to narrowly escape thanks to the help of Rob Herman in his S4. Post-battle, Hannah is having some trouble syncing with her Death Stinger, and it turns out she's actually part Zoid herself, having Z cells implanted into her brain. So we're kind of going full Tokyo Ghoul here, I guess. In the background, we've got a bit of an internal feud between the Empire and the Prozen's Knights. So our good friend Lieutenant Kirsch decides to respectfully have a quick peek at the Death Stinger, just in case it contains any malicious software. Turns out it does, takes control of Krish and goes on a absolute massive baby rage, to say the least. After wiping out a bunch of the Imperial soldiers, it makes its way to the city of Mule. Van once again tries to put up a fight in defense of the city, but gets his ass absolutely handed to him. Right before the killing blow, fortunately enough, he gets bailed out again, this time by Irvine in his new and improved Stealth Viper. This bad boy is now known as the Stealth Dragon, and you cannot tell me it isn't just a Cyber Dragon from Yu-Gi-Oh! I mean, look at it. While Irvine plays the distraction card, a goddamn hover cargo appears. Yeah, remember that big old transporter Zoid from the New Century anime? It's back, and it is ready, willing, and able to surgically remove the heart from Ceasar in the Blade Liger and transfer it into the shell of a Liger Zero. And of course, Van just kind of accepts this with no hesitation, which is one of my first major gripes with the Chaotic Century manga, outside of course the pacing that I've already kind of mentioned. Van simply just accepting this feels so out of character. I feel like even in this manga rendition of Van Flyheight, he should have had a reaction similar to that of Irvine in the anime. In the Chaotic Century anime, Irvine's command wolf suffers a near fatal blow from the Genobreaker. And of course, Irvine is mourning the soon-to-be loss of his partner. Dr. D comes into the picture, suggesting that he could save the command wolf's life by transplanting its DNA into the lightning sykes, which is a new concept created by the Guardian Force. But Irvine is not down for his partner to be used for some experiment, and even tries to throw hands with Dr. D for even suggesting it. After letting the thought weigh on him for some time, he eventually comes to the conclusion that it isn't fair for him to make the decision on whether the command wolf rests here or not, and eventually decides to take Dr. D up on his offer because he knows that the wolf would want to live to fight another day and eventually give the Genobreaker a healthy dose of payback. This train of thought would make so much sense for Van to go through right now, especially in this manga because of the heavy emphasis we get on Van caring for Zoids as living beings. He should have to take a step back and really reconsider his position, because if he chooses to restore Caesar in this way, he's just gonna carry on fighting. And is that really what's best for him? This whole section was the perfect opportunity for Van to grow as a character, and maybe even partially empathize with Raven's position, becoming unsure of himself, maybe even thinking if he lets Caesar die, he'd become more like Raven. But by that same token, if he forces Caesar to live and fight, how does that really make himself any better than him? This manga even gives Van the ability to see inside of a Zoid's heart and see its memories and its life. So he could have actually had proper dialogue with Caesar the Zoid to see if this is something he wanted. But all this potential just gets brushed aside for the instant gratification of a flashy new power-up. Van even goes so far as to recklessly rush the transformation so he can get back out there and fight the Death Stinger quicker. I get that it is a high pressure situation and Irvine can only last so long out there, but it just doesn't make sense for this to be such a quick decision he can make off the top of his head. So back to the fight, and we get to see Fiona's perspective, trying to convince Lulu, the leader of Mule, to use the city's stationary barrier Zoid to help assist Van in protecting the city. Lulu is hesitant to do this, and rightfully so, as she doesn't want Mule to be involved in a war. But eventually Fiona wins her over, and the city's stationary Zoid turns into a giant butterfly which shines its rays onto the Liger Zero and Van. The Zero gets a buff, sheds its armor to speed up, and absolutely butchers the Death Stinger. But before anyone can relax, a JoJo arrow comes straight out of nowhere and brings the Death Stinger back to life. The tip of this arrow is made up of a shadow key, the same kind Van used way back when to restore the shield Liger. And the arrow was fired by none other than the Death Stinger's actual pilot, Lieutenant Hannah. She knows she has now caused the Death Stinger a certain death and actually seems remorseful for that. Nonetheless, despite all of that, Van and the Zero put the Death Stinger out of its misery, and we now proceed to volume 13, the second to last volume. Yet the story doesn't quite feel close to wrapping up, does it? Well, Van gets sent on a side quest to Mount Isolina to try and get back Lulu's father's old Zoid. Upon arriving there, he meets Rosa, a girl who'd recently inherited this Zoid from her father. And because of the circumstances in which she got this Zoid, Van just couldn't bring himself to take it off her to return to Lulu. Apparently doing this means that Van passed some sort of test that was set out for him, and Rosso and Viola from the Alcobolino gang come to pick him up to take him to see Mr. Chen. Lo and behold, this is another test of some kind, and Fiona, Irvine, and Moonbay are lifted off out of the way, while Van is left to fight Rosso and Viola. We're now piloting a Liger Zero Schneider and Liger Zero Jaeger respectively. Van, in his naked Liger Zero, takes out both Rosso and Viola in one move, busting both of the Liger's jaws, rendering them out of commission. After this flawless victory, the man himself, Donnie Chen, master of the floating city of Hourai, shows himself, and he is the spitting image of Raven. After Van attempts to bash his skull in, we then learn that he isn't in fact Raven, but he is Raven's twin brother, which is where we learn that Raven's real name is Joyce Chen. Hourai, the flying Zoid city, says it has some intel on the Zoid Eve, so of course the gang enter its Zoid core room so they can talk to it. This Zoid spirit, celestial body, human avatar, whatever you want to call it, that the city of Hourai has, looks a lot like Fiona, which is a bit odd too. We learn from Hourai that the Zoid Eve is the mother of all Zoids. Literally. It's basically, Adam and Eve combined. All generations from Zoids derive from the Zoid Eve. Lore implications brushed aside, Hourai and Donnie believe it is Van's destiny to take on Prozan, big bad from the Empire, destroy what is known as D, which if you've watched the anime you'd know is the Deathsaurer, and help Raven, as Shadow will have an integral role later on. Now, after what feels like forever, we actually switch back to Raven's perspective. For the past 3 months since his defeat to Van, he's been training with his new Zoid, the Berserk Fury, with his most recent achievement being absolutely humiliating 2 of Prozan's knights, one of which was piloting a Genobreaker. And as if at this point he wasn't strong enough, within a few panels, we get unveiled to us the upgraded Berserk Fury, the Berserk Fury Shadow Edge. Within these 3 months of training, Raven kept his promise to Van and did not destroy a single Zoid. But the old shady man, Dr. F, who's been creating all of these crazy powerful Zoids up until this point, essentially tells Raven that he thinks he's gone soft, and that maybe Raven doesn't actually want to kill Zoids anymore. Raven quickly dispels that thought, telling the Doctor that killing Zoids is his one reason to live, just in case he wasn't edgy enough. While this is all happening, the Empire decrypts a decoy message from the Republic, luring Raven out to the mountains to finally face off against Van once again. And before this battle even starts, we get to learn where Raven's hatred for Zoids even came from in the first place. When he was a child, an out-of-control Zoid killed his entire family. Aside from Donnie, of course, who was adopted out to their uncle and wasn't around at the time. Raven just does not want to bring back this memory and proceeds to attack Van, who fights back with his new, flashy, and improved Liger Zero, Caesar the King, created by Melissa Sue sometime in this 3-month period. During this battle, Raven goes kinda mad and the Fury ends up going rampant. So Van, with the help of Zeke and Fiona, fuse with the Berserk Fury to gain access to Raven's memories. This whole memory concept and entering other beings' consciousness has been kind of odd from the start, but this definitely pushes the boundaries of it. The only way I can really explain it is that Raven is fused with Shadow, who is fused with the Berserk Fury, so that's why Van and Zeke and Fiona can infiltrate Raven's mind through that daisy chain of events. Nonetheless, Van finds Raven in his consciousness and chooses violence. Right after trying to beat some sense into him, Van decides to take a step back and use his words, telling Raven that the family Zoid was infected with a virus, so it's not like it did it on purpose. As if that makes things any better. So needless to say, that doesn't exactly help. But Van then comparing the situation to his own life, as his father also passed away because of Zoids, does lead Raven to finally open up, admitting to Van that he knows it wasn't the Zoids' fault, it was all his fault. He wanted to use his family Zoid to go on a survey mission with his sister, so he implanted navigation data from her car into the Zoid. This unfortunately corrupted the Zoid, causing it to go rampant. Raven tried to get in the cockpit to stop it from happening, but unfortunately was locked in there, and at that point was forced to watch as the wild Zoid tore his family apart. Raven had always blamed himself deep down, but could not handle that weight. So he channeled that into his hatred for Zoids. Van tells Raven that at the end of the day, it really wasn't his fault. There's just no way he could have foreseen that tragic outcome. We get a lot of tears, but Raven inevitably comes around to what Van was saying and feels like that weight he's been carrying around for so long is finally lifted off his shoulders. And I gotta say, I absolutely love the manga's version of Raven here. He just displays so much more emotion, and I really think I prefer this backstory for Raven compared to what the anime shows us. And while overall I still prefer the anime's rendition of Raven, I gotta say the manga does do a fantastic job of portraying him. I just wish we had more time with him so these scenes would hit so much harder. Because if I was coming into this manga without any prior knowledge of the Chaotic Century anime, or a strong loving bias towards Zoids as a whole, these scenes would not have hit anywhere near as hard as they did, which is a real shame, and a big factor in that just all comes down to the pacing of this manga. The Berserk Fury stops and Van, Raven, Zeke and Shadow emerge from the cockpit safe and sound. And that's it. That is officially the end of our 14-volume run of Zoids Chaotic Century. And to be perfectly honest, if subplots like the Zoid Eve, Dr. F, Prozen, the Deathsaurer were never really mentioned in the manga and it just focused on this rivalry between Van and Raven, finishing off with this climax battle of wills, I would have been satisfied with this ending and enjoyed this manga overall a lot more. Seeing Raven being held up on Van's shoulder like bros looking back at Fiona is an awesome panel and would have been a fantastic way to end the series. If only there just weren't all these lingering questions and subplots we hadn't yet explored. Which brings us into Zoids Chaotic Century EX. Yes, just when we thought it was over, we get 7 extra chapters, which really start delving into these other lore aspects of the series and moves the plot along further. And I can't lie to you, if you didn't really think some of the stuff we've had leading up to this point was a bit odd yet, EX is definitely the part where you're going to start thinking things are a little bit weird, even for Zoids. Kicking off this continuation is another backstory to when Raven first met Shadow. Traumatized from having to watch his whole family die, he endlessly wanders until he stumbles upon some old ruins. And similarly to Van, he finds Shadow in a capsule. Immediately, he chooses violence, tries to kill Shadow, but they end up merging instead. Melissa Sue deducts that the reason Shadow merged with Raven is because his heart sought the destruction of Zoids, and Shadow's ability complements that. Vice versa when it comes to Zeke, Van wanted to heal and protect Zoids, so Zeke combined with him. So Zeke and Shadow are essentially a yin and yang. Raven then gives some info to the gang about this Dr. F that he knows, the one that created all of these crazy powerful Zoids up until this point, who's more than likely going to be the one behind D. We then get some pretty decent deduction from Van saying that this Dr. F seemed to know Shadow, And when Raven found Shadow, there wasn't a second capsule there. So that means if Fiona is anything to go by, there should have been a second capsule with a companion there for Shadow. Then out of nowhere, Dr. F magically appears. He uses a Shadow key merged with a flute to play a sound that debilitates all the Zoids in the area, aside from Shadow of course. Dr. F commands Shadow to take Fiona and they fuck off real quick, which is a very quick way to prove Van's presumption right. Turns out Fiona is taken hostage by Prozan, who tells her that they were born for the same purpose, which was to bring a peaceful death to all Zoids. Switching back to Van and the gang, Melissa goes full science mode and starts talking about genomes, explaining that the Zoids are made up of a Z, O, I, and D genome, which I guess is where they got their name from. But Shadow is made up of a bunch of anti-Zoid genomes, which explains his power. Needless to say, while this lesson is happening, Van isn't really having a bar of it because Fiona just got kidnapped and he wants to go out and save her. But it was really great to see Irvine finally stepping in and bringing Van down a peg, because it was really needed in a stressful time like this. Essentially, what we know so far is that Zeke and Shadow are yin and yang, which means the only Zoid that can counteract Shadow's anti-Zoid genomes would be Zeke, with pro-Zoid genomes, or just more Zoid genomes, I guess. The only problem is Shadow's been around much longer and is far more experienced and developed. So they gotta push Zeke to the limit and train him up fast. Kinda like the Hollow training arc in Bleach, really thrown into the deep end there. To do this, Raven jumps in the Berserk Fury and stress tests the hell out of Van and Zeke, who don't even fuse with Ceasar at this point. They just combine full AOT style and fight him little Zoid to Berserk Fury. Melissa also does some little power scaling of her own, talking about how much mindset can impact a fight, saying the only reason Van had such an overwhelming victory against Raven in the Berserk Fury Shadow Edge was because his mind was clear and his resolve was solid, whereas Raven was conflicted and lost his composure due to his past trauma resurfacing. So needless to say, Raven messes up Van and Zeke here, casually slicing Zeke's leg off. He even goes in for a finishing blow as if to kill him, confident enough that Van won't let himself lose that easily. So of course, what else would we need but a classic anime flashback scene to get them through this? But because this is the Zoids Chaotic Century Manga, we're going to connect to Zeke's heart instead. If I haven't made it evident enough, I'm not the biggest fan of this concept, but I could look past it. It got a bit weirder when these stationary Zoids like Wendine and Hourai had human-like avatars, but again, it only happened every so often, so I guess I could look past it. But for God's sake, they not only had to give Zeke a human-like avatar as well, they had to go and make it a lolly. Okay, it isn't exactly a lolly because Zeke literally is an infant, but come on man, don't think I don't see what they're trying to do there. Nonetheless, we learned that Zoids are technically all female and reproduce with themselves, kind of like, I don't know, Queen Marika and Elden Ring. I don't know man, it feels like we're getting a little bit too deep with the oddness, and this lore is getting a bit too complex and convoluted. I'm not really down for it. Also, it turns out Fiona is technically a Zoid herself, just like Zeke and the Liger Zero. So I don't really know about the legality of her and Van's relationship, but all I do know is that Van's apparently cool with it. And that the Zoids manga is turning even more so into a really weird TLC special, chapter by chapter. Nonetheless, Van manages to encourage Zeke and they fuck up the Berserk Fury, no problem. Oh, and Zeke also grew wings, just like Shadow. Zeke can be your angel and Shadow can be your devil. We change perspective back to Fiona and get some backstory on Lieutenant Hannah, but at this point, who really cares? Switching back to Van, he heads over to Imperial territory to meet with Emperor Rudolph, who is another character we know from the anime. And similarly to the anime, Van has no idea who his Royal Highness actually is and treats him just like any other guy and hits him with some harsh realities from the get-go. Once that comes to a close, we get a little tea party with the Emperor so they can discuss Prozan. And even as immature as Van has seemed throughout the manga so far, he actually manages to see the nuance of this situation, realizing a lot of people in the Empire probably don't even consider Prozan to be a bad guy. And out of absolutely nowhere, Shadow shows up in a massive Titan form, looking like some big old Digimon or something. I mean, seriously, look at the size of this thing. Van, of course, fuses with Zeke to try and fight him, and that's it. Now we've actually come to the end. That right there is all of the manga material we have to date. I'm unsure if this story will ever get a true conclusion, and while I'm not seething at the mouth wanting more, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't at least a bit curious to see how the story pans out. So maybe we'll get there one day. But wait, there's more. Yes, before we conclude what I can only imagine is a monster of a video, we have just a teensy bit more content that I think you'd be interested in. One singular spin-off chapter known as Zoids XG Crossover Generations, which, if you haven't guessed it already, is a crossover between Zoids Chaotic Century and Zoids Genesis. And man, I absolutely love this, because it just feeds into the headcanon I have always had about Zoids Genesis being a far-off future in the same timeline long after Chaotic Century takes place. We literally get some Yu-Gi-Oh! Bonds Beyond Times level of crossover here. Ruji Familon, the protagonist of Zoids Genesis, is having some doubts about his ability as a pilot, because really he is only just a kid and he arguably has the most powerful Zoid in the whole group, the Murasame Liger. To uplift him a bit, Kotana tells him a story about a legendary pilot of old. In a prehistoric civilization, the planet was once saved by a 14-year-old boy and his Liger. And of course, while they don't know it, we for a fact know she's talking about Van and his Liger. After resting on it, Ruji magically wakes up right in front of this Liger of legend. He's been brought way back in time to, conveniently enough, meet Van Flyheight. They chat a bit and Ruji just gets so confused about things like how Zoids are manufactured rather than just dug out of the earth or the ocean, which again just proves the point that the Zoids in Genesis are just some ancient technology from old past civilizations left behind after some other planet-shattering calamity. Anyhow, Ruji jumps in the cockpit with Van and they get into a fight. Afterwards, Ruji is so impressed with the Liger's capabilities, he calls Ceasar the king, before simply disappearing without Van really realizing what just happened. Regardless, Van, while confused, obviously took that name to heart, because once introduced, that new form of the Liger is called Liger Zero, Ceasar the king. And now we have actually come to a close. The Zoids Chaotic Century manga is over and our journey has come to an end. I hope you all enjoyed this one. It has taken me forever to make. This isn't the big project I had in the background though. There is still something I'm working on, but it may be a couple months till that arrives. However, unlike this video, I'm not going to hold off future videos for that project. That's just, yeah, a fun one. Anyhow, as always, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it. Feel free to hit that like button, subscribe for more, and leave a comment below letting me know what you thought. Have you read this manga before? Is this your first time ever hearing of a Zoids manga? Let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great day, and I will see you all next time. Peace.